All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist, and today I have a very special guest, a philosopher and thinker who I admire all of their work. I have Dr. Ben Woodard, who's currently a fellow at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry in Berlin. He received his PhD in Theory and Criticism from Western University in 2016, and from 2017 to 2020, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Philosophy and Sciences of Art at Leuphana University, where he completed a habilitation on the analytic and continental divide in the history of philosophy. Since 2020, Ben has lectured at Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy and the School of Materialist Research at the New Centre for Research and Practice. In broad terms, his work focuses on the relationship between naturalism, idealism, and the long 19th century. More specifically, his current project focuses on the politicization of biology by way of eugenics, statistics, and the neglect of historical concepts in biological research. Ben also writes on science fiction, horror, film, literature, and is a translator of French philosophy, particularly the work of Gilles Châtelet. He is also the author of numerous articles and 3 books, which are all fantastic, by the way. I highly recommend any of them. Slime Dynamics, A Generation, Mutation, and the Creep of Life, 2012. On the Ungrounded Earth Towards a New Geography, 2013, and Schelling's Naturalism, Motion, Space, and the Volition of Thought in 2019, which is a fantastic text on Schelling. He has 2 forthcoming books, Unhabited Science Fiction and the Decolonial from Zero Books, and an exciting new text coming out on F.H. Bradley and the History of Philosophy Animating a Lost Idealism through Edinburgh University Press. So welcome, Ben, to the Young Idealist, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for doing this selfless work that you do on the channel.
Well, the reason why I have asked you to come on this show today, I mean, my channel is normally on classical German philosophy. We're kind of leaving Germany and flying over to England today. Is because of your habilitation, which I've read and loved and admired on both Bradley and Wilfrid Sellars. And you also participated in I think our 2nd annual event on Bradley. So I invited you back here to discuss the life and philosophy of F.H. Bradley. So why do you think Bradley is important, maybe today in philosophy or in the history of philosophy?
Yeah, so I think his importance in the history of philosophy is maybe outweighs his importance today, or at least the obvious one. He's peculiar, of course, because he is in style and content, he is a continental philosopher. But of course, he was writing in England, and he was writing, right before the sort of continental analytic divide. So he's a continental thinker in England who is the sort of teacher of many of the people who would go on, mentor and teacher of many of the people who would go on to become, the sort of founders of Anglophone philosophy, of people like Russell and Moore and this kind of thing. So historically, he's kind of at this, huge shift in style and also in tone and also in, what people thought philosophy should be doing. So there's kind of a massive shift there. And then, of course, he also represents, though, which I think maybe this is where his relevance now is more pertinent, or at least easier to trace, is that British idealism is, it's sort of a non-entity for a lot of people. Even people who know history of philosophy often don't know anything about British idealism. It is a little bit a forgotten chapter. But I think why it's so interesting, especially for contemporary philosophy, is that, Bradley and the other British idealists, whether it was Green or Bosanquet, in their different ways, essentially tried to combine kind of so-called common sense empiricism, right? Kind of the good old-fashioned English and Scottish philosophy, with trends from idealism, in particular Hegel, but also Kant, just to some degree, some other German thinkers, but really Hegel is the big one. And I think that the combination of like sort of common sense or philosophy that's about everyday life in some way, whatever that means, that it's about a sort of idealistically infused empiricism, essentially. I think that has become appealing to a lot of contemporary philosophy in various ways. I think a lot of the kind of new realism stuff actually touch, in least in terms of like some general attitudes, kind of touches on similar ground. So that's, I think, maybe and then also like more recent analytic philosophy that tends, that kind of leans more continental, if we want to say that. So, people more connected to like late Wittgenstein or someone like Stanley Cavell or that kind of analytic philosophy shares a lot in common with Bradley. So yeah, I mean it's a sort of funny, not well-trodden path you can follow, that shows how analytic philosophy kind of ended up coming back to Bradley in a certain respect.
Well, thank you for that. I think that was a fantastic answer, actually, and it really helped steer us into understanding this thinker named F.H. Bradley. If you could you possibly give us a kind of brief biography on his life? It doesn't have to be exhaustive, just maybe some of the main events on who he was and the life that he lived.
Yeah, so there's not, in terms of big events, there's not so much to say as far as I know. I mean, I think it's always dangerous with, again, because of his position in the history of philosophy, because he was the dragon that, Russell and Moore had to slay. He was the sort of idealist. And um, a lot of stories and things that got told about him by the students might have been, motivated by something other than biographical accuracy, to put it bluntly. So there's that problem. But the other problem is that he was, by even friendly accounts, by people who knew him, other philosophers who worked at Oxford, he spent pretty much his whole academic life in one place, right? At Merton, right, this part of Oxford. And he lectured there, but he was known to be a recluse. He spent a lot of time alone. He read and wrote a lot. There was he did in his later years, he did some European travels with some friends and had a sort of helpless crush on somebody who we're not 100% sure who they were. We think we know who they were. He dedicates Appearance and Reality to ER. We think we know who it is, but it's not certain. But nothing ever happened with that. And people joked that they wouldn't see him for months at a time. There was some, he apparently really avoided meetings. He really just wanted to sort of do his work and write. He was close to his brother and sister. His youngest brother, I believe, John, drowned tragically when he was very young. And you can kind of see this. Actually, when I was in Oxford for a Schelling event, actually, I stayed for a couple of days to go to Bradley's archive. And also I decided, well, I should go visit his grave. And I literally had to pull, I might have told you this story before, I had to literally pull like the roots off his headstone because it was so, uh, unkempt. It was so neglected. And the gravestone actually has all three brothers together. So there's a kind of, yeah, you kind of see this kind of tragedy and like right there with him. But yeah, there's not really, in terms of like big events in his life, there's not so much that's known as far as I know. As far as I know, and I've read the biographical things there was one. I mean, to go back to the point about stories about him, there was this story that he would shoot cats with his large rifle, but apparently that wasn't true. Apparently, he would shoot the gun to scare away cats from eating birds because he really loved birds. And like I said, he was sort of kind of quite of a loner, we would say now, and quite to himself. But I think when he did help people, he did mentor people, but often more in a private way, like through letters, or he would go for a walk with somebody, and they would be like, they would claim they were transformed by chatting with him. But apparently, he had several disabilities, including they believe he had both auditory and visual agnosia, which essentially means your senses, when given his philosophy, is also kind of interesting. So it means your senses kind of take in the data, but it takes a little bit longer for your brain to kind of process it. So like you'll read a word, like say you read the word bird, and apparently he had to sort of like, he would see the word and know it was a word, but he'd have to consciously like say all the letters. So he'd have to say BIRD, and then he would say ah. And apparently he had the same for hearing. And so people also, again, it's speculation, but that's also perhaps why he only liked to sort of socialize with very close people, why he avoided kind of big meetings and this kind of thing, because I think it would have been very taxing. Supposedly, it was very taxing for him. You can imagine like being in a crowded room and just trying to figure out what people are saying. Writing also, I think there's a lot of melancholy in his writing, but I think at the same time there's a lot of like sort of like deep love for the world and for how like complex it is, but it's always a little bit bittersweet. At least that's the way it reads to me.
That famous remark from Heidegger saying that Aristotle lived and died. We shouldn't really care about biographies of a philosopher. But I kind of modeled these episodes on the old Brian McGee History of Philosophy chats. I used to watch those episodes in my undergraduate, and McGee would always start off with a kind of biography, and then we'd go into um, the philosopher's work, and then of course there's that big comfy couch, and right across from McGee was an interlocutor or a friend and scholar that he would bring on. So thank you so much for the kind of nice biography on him. If you had to, in a sense, uh, maybe say who Bradley's main philosophical influences are and how they are applied in his thought. I mean, you did bring up a couple. You said common sense, empiricism. You also brought up Kant and Hegel, especially. Who would you say are the kind of bigger influences on his writing?
Yeah, it's actually kind of, with Bradley, it's much more difficult to answer that question than I think most philosophers. Like from his ethical, his kind of short thing on ethics from the very beginning, and then his work on logic, and then you look at his work on the appearance and reality, right? The kind of big metaphysics text, and then it gets even, the references to things get even more sparse in the sort of later collected works, in the essays that he wrote, the last things that he wrote, because I think in part it's because of the way he writes. So he doesn't really write like so and so makes this argument and this person makes this argument and I think this, but they're wrong. He does that kind of early on, but he moves away from it pretty fast. So on the one hand, the influences are hard because like you read Appearance and Reality, which is this massive metaphysical tome, and he'll say phrases and sentences which, if you've read Hegel, you're like, this is Hegel. I know this is Hegel, right? Like the language is the same, not only conceptually similar, but even in like the kind of way it's laid out. You're like, okay, this is Hegel, or he'll talk about the various doctrines of the self, and look, okay, this is Kant here. So it's really, so according to him, like he says that Hegel is his biggest influence. But most Hegelians who read him, and I've had this happen to me, where like I've had other people who are Hegelians read him, and they're like, "What the hell are they talking about? Like he what?" And so it's quite strange because he'll reference. I think he's really influenced by parts of the logic, but then he never references the logic. He'll reference the phenomenology of spirit, I think once or twice, maybe in Appearance and Reality. But then the arguments he's making aren't those arguments. So one of the so it's kind of hard to say why is that the case? Because on the other hand, though, especially in his book on logic, he's very, very good at keeping up to date with contemporary debates. So he's really interested. So on the one hand, he has this kind of very small selection of people that he thinks are basically right on certain big topics like Kant and Hegel. But also he engages really, I would say, very charitably and very widely with his contemporaries. And he did this with letters too. So he goes, he's all the time, especially with psychologists, or he has exchanges with and about William James, or with and about Bergson, or with Russell, or with Stout, or these kinds of like other kind of mix of psychology and empiricist thinkers, which hardly anyone reads anymore. But for him, it was like he this was the lively debate he wanted to be a part of. But he sort of, he doesn't really sign on to anyone contemporary in his time. And even the other British idealists, they all kind of disagreed with each other on pretty like fundamental points. So even him and Green and Buss and Cat like didn't agree on a lot. So it's a much harder question to answer for him than I think most philosophers on average. Because in part, the writing, he doesn't write in this kind of scholastic way, really. He kind of writes in these, I mean, some people would complain it's flowery or purple prose. I mean, I quite like it. I say it's a bit like if you took bits of Hegel, but then, you had Henry James rewrite it or something. Like it's a bit this kind of thing. And so I think for influences, you really kind of have to read the content of his text and see, okay, here he's referencing, even though he doesn't actually reference it, like here he's talking about this, here he's talking about that. And it was there was a really huge moment for me when I was working on the habilitation text, and I was at a conference, and Ian Hamilton Grant was sitting next to me, and he said, "Oh, well, Bradley was hugely influenced by Hegel's philosophy of mind." And there's, as far as I can tell, no trace of that, like explicitly in Bradley, I don't think. But that I can remember. But if you read Hegel's philosophy of mind, you're like, yes, it's basically so much of the logic, but even more so, a lot of Appearance and Reality is like critiquing basically Hegel's idea of the self relative to the Kantian idea of the self and trying to work that out. Yeah, so the short answer is Hegel. The long answer is that, or something like what I just said, I think.
Do you think there's any, I mean, because we both work on Schelling, or still work on Schelling. Do you think there is any correlation between Bradley's work and Schelling at all?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I sort of hoped there would be, and I looked for it, but I'm not so sure there is. I think he mentions him once, I think, or he mentions him in passing, but really it's like he just says like Kant, Schelling, Hegel or something. So I didn't find any engagement with Schelling, which on the one hand is not, I think it's not surprising in a couple ways, because one, of course, there was an earlier English reception of Schelling, But from what I know about it, from like Henry Crabb Robinson attending the lectures and the Court of Whole Relationship, basically with people who are also reading the Romantics, right? We're also reading Schelling and translating it. And of course, there was this discourse. But a lot of that, at least at that time period, which would have been, I guess, like mid 1800s, with like also George Eliot and others reading it, also reading Spinoza. That was like a much more sort of materialist reading of Schelling, and also kind of interested in the natural philosophy stuff, and also how Schelling related to Spinoza. And I don't think, I mean, Bradley wouldn't have been interested in that at all, because from what he says, he says this kind of openly in Appearance and Reality, and maybe it's also in the Logic, where he sort of says, he's like, I kind of like, he's like, science is interesting, but like, I don't really care about it. He's like, that's just not my thing. Just like, okay, fine. Um, but it also makes me far likely to see the connections, probably because my reading of Schelling is so, I mean, as you know, is so focused on the Natur philosophy and reading Schelling as a thinker of nature. And nature is just not a topic Bradley gives much time to at all. It's just not the thing he cares about. So yeah, I don't see a strong connection there, but um, I think one could be made in terms of maybe how they view the absolute in certain ways, or like the idea of a continuum of experience. I think something could be made there, but it would take some doing, I think, to find the kind of fine details.
So just some thank you for that lovely rich answer. Just before we jump into the meat of Bradley's philosophy, I was wondering, how did you actually get into Bradley's philosophy? Where did you first hear of his work, and how did you, because you jokingly told me once that you got kind of, when you first read him, you got obsessed with his work and wanted to read everything by him. I felt a kind of kindredship with you when you said that, because I get these obsessions of philosophers too, and I want to read all of their work and all of this stuff. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, it was a total kind of just boring accident, really, because I had finished my dissertation. I was living in a very kind of strange artist pseudo residency place in France. Just kind of figuring out what I was going to do, post dissertation defense. And a friend of mine, we're working a lot together. We organized some events. We actually wrote a piece together. His name's Matt Hare, and we wrote a piece about Schelling and Chaudelet, and like sort of the limits of natural and artificial languages, stuff like this. But anyways, we kind of, since we were living together at the time, we sort of thought, okay, well, let's, both, two underemployed philosophers, let's kind of do a research project. And so he started researching really intensely the history of empiricism. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to do like the history of idealism to like fill in all the gaps that I didn't have, right? Because since, it's like, okay, I don't have a job, I'm like living for almost free. I might as well like do something long-term constructive. Uh, and yeah, so I basically said, okay, like classical stuff I know pretty well, right? German idealism, I know, Kant and German idealism, that stuff, I've done that for my dissertation and, for the Schelling book, as it, turned into. But then so it's kind of like, okay, what's the next step? And it was British idealism. And so I read, so Bill Mander's right book, the one kind of big book on British idealism, and like reading about each of them. And I got to Bradley and I was just like, what the hell is this? And I really had this moment of like, what? There's no relations, there's no objects, there's only the absolute, everything else is appearance, but like appearance isn't mere appearance. And I'm just like, what? And so I sort of just was like very confused, because everyone else was weird, but like in a way that didn't strike me as totally bonkers. And so I just said, okay. And I just picked up Appearance and Reality and started to read it. Um, and I had a few conversations like with people who knew, not many people know Bradley, but like Ian Grant, he knows him, and so I talked to him, and just figured, okay, I guess I'm just gonna go down this rabbit hole, and that's what I did. And so that's why I joke I accidentally wrote a book on him, because that was not the plan. Right? The plan was just to kind of be able to have like a real history of idealism in my pocket that I could then do other book projects with. But yeah, I just got completely stuck. And then it was also kind of worked out nicely because my friend I mentioned, because he was doing empiricism, and so then we organized several events, and we were both kind of in this place where we're kind of figuring out, okay, like really what's the difference between idealism and empiricism, like in the fine details. And so him reading lots of Hume and Meinong and me reading Bradley, it just kind of, it connected in like a very unexpected way. Yeah, so that's why it happened.
That seems like a really creative project, the two of this kind of dual project that you both had going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I kind of wish happened more often, where there was a small group of us that organized events. We did like 3 events a year for several years. Uh, but yeah, we would try to come up with a kind of somewhat nebulous, weird concept that we could all that our work all would touch on, even though our work was all different. So yeah, the one there we kind of like we talked about like the stubbornness of the empirical was one, or we talked about like the autonomy of the formal. So these kinds of like seemingly very specific, but actually when you kind of, you know, take a phrase like that and then kind of pull it through the history of philosophy, you get kind of unexpected results. And so yeah, it was really like helpful and constructive. I got a lot out of it. Yeah.
Um, so I guess when someone thinks of Bradley, the first thing they think of is his regress. So I was wondering if we could take us down, I guess, memory lane through Bradley's regress.
Yeah, so he has, and people, and when I say people, it's mostly analytic philosophers, generally, who kind of argue about this. So and they argue about how many regresses are there in Bradley? Is it just one? Is it several? And kinds of things. But essentially what it is that, so I mean, he has a form of it in his logic, but then the form, which I can talk about, maybe if it relates, but the one that people know generally is the one from Appearance and Reality, because he's essentially saying, right, because Bradley essentially is saying, okay, there's the absolute, which means, there is some under, or like some connective tissue between all our experiences, between everything we call things and events and all this stuff. But we can't articulate it fully with our language or with our ideas or with our reason. And he says, and so one of the consequences of that is all these things that philosophers take to be fundamental or potentially fundamental, like objects, like time, space, relations, right? These are all appearances, actually. None of these things can be really fundamental. And so it's like, okay. And so he kind of goes through them all and kind of says these things don't really stand on their own. And so, yeah, so the regress comes from when he's talking about relations, because he says, look, there's no, you basically say that you can't say there's objects are fundamental because they're either composed of other objects or they're composed of relations between objects, or if they're so fundamental, why would they be attainable as an object separate from the absolute? And then he kind of does this thing with relations, which really freaks people out, and you get the regress because he says, look, if you have a thing, or you have two things in a relation, right? And you say, okay, how does a relation relate to things? And you say, well, a relation is connected to those two things. You say, okay, how does a relation relate to connection that makes it a relation? You say, okay, well, look, a relation is a form of connection, or you can say, it's a, in whatever word you say, right? Bradley can say, well, you're just adding another step, right, to something that you're saying is fundamental. So he's like, look, relations aren't. So he said they're not, their appearances, they're not real, and it's people have kind of addressed this in various ways, and like one of the ways it's talked about is that some people argue that he's like the modern Parmenides, right? That he's this kind of he has this kind of skeptical ungrounding of everything based on a kind of oneness, and it's like, yeah, that fits. But so, and the responses to it is like people do and tried then to sort of say, well, look, logic is like a special function, and they would try to like do all these kinds of games, and people basically had to say, well, this is just nonsense. Like, we can't, you basically have to say we can't operate if that's the case. And Bradley's point isn't just to say you can't use this word anymore, right? His whole point is to say all of these concepts you take to be fundamental actually are limited. And so the question is, how do you use all these kinds of concepts, right? Because he says he doesn't want people to just get stuck in a regress. So, and you don't avoid the regress by saying it's not a real problem. You say the way in which we talk about these things with each other is what's going to make them stick or not, or matter or not whether they're actually foundational in a metaphysical sense. As he says, the same thing with space and time, like you can just, unwind them into other things forever. The point is that when whoever's talking, at that moment about these things, like they're going to make what counts count. I mean, this is the kind of empirical side of his idealism in a way. But yeah, a lot of people just thought this was total nonsense. But at the same time, it's a very hard argument to knock down without kind of appealing to some other kind of tool from left field, essentially, according to him.
Since we're on the kind of appearance and reality train, how do appearance and reality relate in terms of the absolute, in terms of Bradley's absolute? If that's an all right question. I think that's an all right question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the sort of question of the book, right? And again, there's competing answers, some competing answers on that, because for one, lots of people and people who are even sympathetic to Bradley, so often people who do sort of history of analytic philosophy, but who are sympathetic to this stuff. So I think it's like Guy Stock and people like Bill Mander and people like this. In part, it's like, okay, what's the status of the absolute in Bradley becomes one question, right? Because if you say everything you take to be real, like space, like I said, space, time, the self, relations, objects, whatever, none of those things are actually, and by not real, he essentially means they're not self-standing, right? They're not independent, I guess is what he would say. They're not independent entities. And so there's quite a lot of debate about what the absolute is then. Like, is the absolute a thing? Is it like a metaphysical object? And of course, it seems like Bradley has to say no. And so, but of course, there becomes a kind of tricky game, because he essentially says you can't, any time you think you've found the absolute, you just have an appearance of it, right? So for instance, if in the regress, I mean, he thinks the regress, for instance, kind of pushes you to accept something like the absolute. You say, well, look, there must be some connective tissue. There must be some fundamental, like metaphysically fundamental continuity by which all these seemingly fundamental things can operate with each other. But they sort of show an aspect, right? So appearances can have an aspect of the absolute, but never represent it in total. And he has this quite dramatic statement at one point saying, if we could experience the absolute as the absolute, it would be thought suicide. So it's like our brains would melt if we like actually saw the absolute, which then begs the question, okay, so it is it present? It is like it can be presented fully, but it would just be bad, or is it like really a logical impossibility? And so this is where people really have very, very different views of this. I think, I mean, for me, the argument I think is that the absolute in like practical terms, because of course you could just like say, well, you never get the absolute, so I talk about it. And I think the point is that it's like there's a sort of litmus test, there's a kind of limit on fundamentality to everything. And the good thing about that is, I mean, this is the argument I make, is that it means that judgments or just talking about the self or all philosophical discourse has to be collective and has to have some kind of foot in like the appearances that matter, right? So not appearances in general, but like the ones in this conversation now, right? So, and there's a kind of interesting set of papers about what Bradley's logic is relevant for now, and I think this is where a lot of them point to, is that he was really interested in like indexicals and this kind of performative function of speech, right? So the whole point is like the absolute sort of reminds us when we say, hey, look at that, or let's talk about this thing, or, you know, that we always are kind of reminded about our limitations. You know, and so, you know, and I think it also is a huge part of how he understands thought and the self, right? The fact is like, you know, he says like there's my world and there's the world, and they can, you know, and neither, you know, to say either of them is absolute or either of them is mere appearance, you know, doesn't seem to make sense. And so for him, that's the kind of whole struggle of, I mean, not only philosophy, I think of life, is to understand, right, which things are the things worth sharing and talking about, that are that, you know, invoke the absolute in the right way at the right place and time, I guess. That's maybe not a satisfying answer, but
No, I think it was a great answer actually. You went through appearances, you went through the regress, you went through the connection of the absolute to reality. So no, I think you did a great job actually, and I think you've given all of the viewers enough to hold on to in order to, you know, open up a book and read about Bradley. My next question is kind of selfish, and probably my last question. So now I'm super excited that you're actually writing a book on F.H. Bradley, which I think it would be fantastic. Um, is there any way possible you could tell us a little, maybe the theme of the book, or what you're writing on in this text, or what you did write on?
well, I mean, it's yeah, it's maybe it's a bit of a disappointing thing to say. I mean, it's just a reworking of the habilitation, so it's just the sort of published form of that. But trying the sort of difference will be is that instead of presenting, because the way the habilitation is written, right, it's kind of looking at the analytic continental divide and how Bradley kind of relates to that and how he connects to contemporary thought. But for the sake of the book, the idea is for it to be more about Bradley's thought and less about his thought's role in the history of philosophy. So in that sense, it's going to be more. So it's going to be modified version that sort of emphasizes, yeah, like what's the impact or importance of his thought now, right? So the sort of contemporary, you know, connection of his work, which I think is, there's some challenge there. I mean, in part, I think because of like this thing you mentioned with McGee, right? The idea that people are often motivated by, you know, rightly or wrongly, the sort of biography of philosophers' lives, and like that doesn't really work, I think, in the case of Bradley so much because it is such a kind of a sad story. Um, but I think there is, you know, I'm hoping that uh, this sort of, I mean, what I mentioned with like that thought has to be a kind of collective spoken act, almost more than a written act in a way, despite the fact that he wrote giant books. I think that like there's something to that which is interesting to people. And I think the idea of taking experience, you know, really want to emphasize this idea that experience is concept laden, right, as we would say. And so the sense that any kind of empirical gloss of a room or of a view, of course, is completely suffuse and, you know, coded with, you know, memories and like random thoughts and things like this. And I think Bradley was somebody who put a lot of thought into like trying to understand what that means, and like what between people remains isolated and what can be expressed. Right. So again, the absolute of the self also is a kind of limitation in this. So yeah, I mean, so hopefully the book will be a little like peppier, uh more kind of contemporary oriented version of the habilitation. Yeah.
Well, congratulations on that. And thank you very much for kind of navigating us through Bradley's life and his philosophy and, really taking us through. You were very clear and broke down a lot of the more difficult aspects of Bradley's thoughts. So I want to really thank you for being a part of this series.
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me. And like I said, this is really great stuff you're doing and great guests. So yeah, I hope you can continue.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.